The Assyrians were once described as coming down like a wolf on the fold, their warriors shining in purple and gold, their spears glittering like stars over dark waters. Those poetic lines captured the image of a people whose power and discipline shook entire civilizations. Today, we look back at the rise of the world's earliest true empire. At its height, Assyria's rule stretched from the Nile to the Caspian Sea, and from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. It became a pioneer in many fields: the world's first professional army, the first organized postal system, early road networks, and impressive military engineering. The administrative ideas born in Assyria later shaped many great powers, from the Achaemenids to the Ottomans. The Assyrians were a Semitic people whose distant ancestors once lived in the Arabian Peninsula, which at that time was not a desert, but a grassy savanna. During the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, the climate shifted, turning Arabia into the arid land we know today. Because of this change, large groups of Semitic tribes began moving north. Some settled in the Sinai, Palestine, and the Levant, while others continued into Mesopotamia. These migrants, later known as the Akkadians, mixed with the older Sumerian population, absorbing their knowledge and culture. The earliest Assyrian settlements began along the middle Tigris River, in places like Nineveh, Erbil, and Ashur. For many centuries, these towns served larger, more powerful southern kingdoms, including the Empire of Sargon the Great and the realm of Hammurabi. This region lay directly on the trade route linking Babylonia to Anatolia, so these cities naturally grew as commercial centers. Ashur, in particular, developed into far more than a stop between Babylon and the north. It became a thriving trading hub. Merchants from Ashur created entire networks of trading colonies in Anatolia. The largest outpost, called Karum-Kanesh, became the heart of Assyrian commercial activity. From east to west, they shipped lapis lazuli, tin, and copper, while returning with timber, fine wool, silver, and gold. This flow of wealth transformed Ashur into a strong and independent city. By the 19th century BC, Ashur was not only the city's name, but also the name of its main god. Like most Mesopotamian cities, the people worshipped a patron deity. Babylon had Marduk, Ur had Enlil, and Uruk honored Anu. But for the early Assyrians, Ashur was more than a guardian or symbol. He represented the very spirit of the city's foundation. Even the writing of the god's name and the city's name were identical. To the people living there, the city itself was an extension of Ashur. The government of Ashur at this early stage was not yet a kingdom. The god Ashur, not any human, was considered the true king. The city's ruler acted only as his earthly representative. His power was limited by two groups: a council of elders and an elected official known as the Limu. The Limu, chosen yearly, led the council and controlled finances. Every major decision needed approval from this council, and funding depended on the Limu's agreement. This system of shared power lasted until roughly the 18th–17th centuries BC. Around that time, peace in Anatolia broke down as wars erupted, damaging trade routes. Several Assyrian colonies, including Karum-Kanesh, were destroyed. Ashur lost its commercial advantage and fell back under Babylonian control. During the 16th century BC, the region became a battleground once again. Babylon and the Hittites fought fiercely, ultimately leading to the Hittite sack of Babylon in 1531 BC. Soon afterward, Kassite tribes entered Mesopotamia and took control of the southern kingdom. But Assyria did not become independent. At the same time, groups known as the Hurrians moved into modern-day Syria and formed the powerful kingdom of Mitanni. For nearly 200 years, Ashur served as a Mitanni vassal. Though officially independent, the city had no real freedom. Mitanni rulers forced Ashur to tear down its own fortifications and stationed representatives within the city council to supervise decisions. Little is recorded about this era, But it is clear the Assyrians learned important military technologies from their overlords, including the lightweight chariot, the composite bow, and early forms of scale armor. By the 15th and 14th centuries BC, Ashur regained its independence. King Ashur-bel-nisheshu used internal chaos in Mitanni to rebuild Ashur's walls, an action close to declaring war. Mitanni, too distracted, failed to retaliate. Later, Ashur-uballit I pushed out Mitanni's agents entirely, declared himself king, and sought support from Egypt. This bold revival upset Babylon. In a message to the pharaoh, the Babylonian king Burnaburiash II angrily insisted that Assyria was still his vassal and demanded Egypt refuse diplomatic contact with them. His complaints were ignored. A shift in identity began. No longer did the people see themselves as just the residents of a single city. They saw themselves as a territorial kingdom, Assyria, the land of Ashur. Royal titles changed as well. Kings adopted grander phrases such as King of the World and emphasized expansion. One important title meant the one who enlarges the borders, showing how central conquest had become. The Assyrians believed their god Ashur was the highest divine power, and that their land represented cosmic order amid surrounding chaos. Expanding their borders was therefore seen as a sacred duty. Resistance to Assyrian rule was treated as both foolish and disrespectful to Ashur. As the religion evolved, Ashur rose even higher in rank. If he was king of all gods, then the Assyrian ruler naturally saw himself as king over all earthly rulers. With this belief, Assyrian campaigns became relentless. Assyria's renewed strength soon played a central role in the downfall of Mitanni. King Adad-nirari I struck the first major blow by conquering part of Mitanni's territory and forcing its ruler, Shatuar-adharn, to accept Assyrian control. Assyrians said that he was made to carry the yoke of Ashur, meaning he became a humbled vassal. Shortly after this, the Hittites destroyed Mitanni's capital, Wasukani. When Shalmaneser I came to the throne, he completed what was left of the conquest and absorbed the rest of Mitanni's lands into Assyria. Another rise in power came under Tukulti-Ninurta I. He defeated Babylonia in the south and crushed Hittite forces in the north. Assyria could have become a full empire at this point, but Tukulti-Ninurta was murdered in a palace revolt. His death caused civil conflict, weakening the kingdom. At the same time, the late Bronze Age collapse swept across the Near East. Many great kingdoms fell, but Assyria survived, though reduced to a smaller core region along the Tigris. By the end of the 10th century BC, Assyria recovered and began expanding again under Ashur-dan the Scepters and later kings. At first, these campaigns were defensive, aimed at stopping raids from tribes like the Arameans, the Nairi people from Armenia, and the Medes from the Iranian plateau. But soon, these defensive actions turned into aggressive expansion. A major reason for Assyria's success was its military innovations. They were among the first to develop real cavalry units, not just chariot riders. Early Assyrian cavalry fought as mounted archers, but over time they added armored riders similar to early versions of Parthian cataphracts. Their engineering skills also set them apart. They used battering rams effectively against mud brick walls, built siege towers for archers, and dug tunnels to bring down enemy defenses. While earlier armies relied on long sieges, the Assyrians perfected the art of direct assaults and storming cities quickly. They also created an organized postal system for government communication across conquered lands. Before this, distant regions were hard to control, so empires often allowed local rulers to stay in power as long as they paid tribute. The Assyrians changed everything. They placed garrisons in captured cities and appointed governors who were closely monitored through frequent reports sent by the postal network. To support this system and move armies rapidly, they constructed long roads, becoming one of the first civilizations to create an extensive paved road infrastructure. All of these achievements, strong logistics, new engineering, large armies, and a growing government, required huge resources. But Assyria did not have a formal tax system yet. Their solution was constant warfare. Each year, kings launched campaigns not only to expand their borders, but also to gather wealth from conquered lands. Plunder, tribute, and forced labor became essential parts of the empire. This era reached its peak under Ashurnasirpal-Pul, whose conquests were infamous for extreme cruelty. He described his own actions in chilling detail, boasting about building towers from severed heads, impaling young men around captured cities, and burning maidens alive. His words were meant to spread fear, making other peoples too terrified to resist. When his armies entered a city, death was nearly guaranteed. Prisoners were beheaded, torn apart, flayed, impaled, drowned, burned, or buried alive. This policy of terror made many kingdoms surrender without a fight. Even a bloodless victory was described in terms of fear. Shalmaneser III wrote that when his army approached, whole cities panicked and chose to submit. Their king crawled before him and begged for mercy. Shalmaneser spared him, but forced him to pay heavy tribute and give hostages to guarantee loyalty. In the short term, this terror strategy worked. Neighboring peoples trembled at the thought of Assyrian armies. But in the long run, the brutality created deep, lasting hatred. Nearly every surrounding nation came to despise the Assyrians. Even after later kings used less cruelty, the Assyrian reputation never recovered. The goal of terror had been to break people's will. Instead, it made them determined to rebel at the first opportunity. Whenever Assyria showed signs of weakness, uprisings erupted everywhere. In the north, people united to form the Kingdom of Urartu. In the west, Aramean tribes formed their own powerful confederations. Babylon also rebelled frequently, refusing to accept Assyrian rule. The constant fighting eventually pushed Assyria into decline. Conquered lands were drained of wealth and population and could no longer support the empire. Trade slowed, local governors became less loyal, and many attempted to act independently. Internal power struggles and endless wars weakened the state, until, by the late 9th century BC, Assyria controlled little more than its capital and nearby territory. However, Assyria was not finished yet. In 745 BC, a new ruler, Tiglath-Pileser III, seized power through a military coup and completely transformed the kingdom. His reforms revived Assyria and prepared it for another period of expansion. Before his rule, the Assyrian army was mostly a militia made up of free citizens who supplied their own weapons. Tiglath-Pileser III created Assyria's first professional army. He recruited poor farmers, equipped them with government-made weapons, and trained them regularly. He organized the forces into specialized groups: chariots, cavalry, light infantry, heavy infantry, and engineers. This made the army far more disciplined and effective. To support the new army, he carried out major tax and administrative reforms. He introduced new taxes and labor requirements. He also reduced the size of provinces and increased their number, making it harder for governors to gain too much power. Most importantly, he began appointing eunuchs as governors, believing they were less likely to create dynasties or rebel. With a stronger state and a professional army, Tiglath-Pileser III launched fresh campaigns. And this time, the way Assyria treated conquered lands changed drastically. They introduced a policy called nahu, or uprooting. Instead of simply demanding tribute, they moved entire populations from one region to another. The purpose was to break people's ties to their homeland, erase identity, and make rebellion nearly impossible. This policy reshaped the Near East. Arameans, originally living in Syria, were scattered across the empire. Over time, their language became dominant. Aramaic eventually became the common language of the Near East, even rivaling Assyria's own tongue. Records began to be written in both Akkadian and Aramaic. and carvings showed scribes writing in both languages, one on clay tablets, the other on papyrus. The uprooting policy and Tiglath-Pileser's reforms strengthened Assyria rapidly. In 745 BC, he entered Babylonia, helping King Nabonassar against Chaldean tribes and the kingdom of Elam. Nabonassar became his vassal, and Tiglath-Pileser took the grand title King of Sumer and Akkad. He then subdued the Medes on the Iranian plateau. Having tested his new army in multiple battles, he turned toward the powerful kingdom of Urartu. A vast alliance of states joined Urartu, forming a massive coalition that was expected to challenge Assyria seriously. But in 743 BC, at the Battle of Arpad, Assyria crushed the alliance. Many cities surrendered immediately, offering tribute rather than face destruction. In 735 BC, Tiglath-Pileser marched into Urartu's territory. He reached their capital, Tushpa, along Lake Van, and destroyed its lower city. The fortress on the cliff could not be taken, but Urartu was left weakened and unable to challenge Assyria again. In 732 BC, Tiglath-Pileser conquered Damascus. Phoenician states accepted his power, paying massive tribute to avoid ruin. Even powerful cities like Tyre offered huge amounts of gold. Israel and Judah became vassal kingdoms. His campaigns reached the border of Egypt, where he captured the Philistine capital, Ashkelon. In 729 BC, he united Assyria and Babylonia under his rule and crowned himself king of Babylon. In just 15 years, he turned Assyria into a vast empire stretching from Lake Van to Egypt and from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. After Tiglath-Pileser III's death, his successors, Shalmaneser-Fi, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, continued the aggressive expansion he had begun. Under their rule, Assyria reached its greatest size at the start of the 7th century BC. Egypt was conquered, Elam was crushed, Cyprus fell under Assyrian control, rebellious Phoenician cities were defeated, Urartu was pushed far north, and large areas of Anatolia came under Assyrian power. In 689 BC, during a Babylonian rebellion, Sennacherib completely destroyed Babylon. He leveled the city, flooded it with the waters of the Euphrates, and deported the population. Even the city's sacred statues were carried off to Nineveh. Babylon would later be rebuilt, but Sennacherib's wrath left a deep scar in Mesopotamian memory. His son, Esarhaddon, rebuilt the city and oversaw the empire at its peak. Under him, Assyria's domination of the Near East looked absolute. No kingdom seemed capable of challenging its might. Esarhaddon planned for a stable future and named his son Ashurbanipal as heir to the Assyrian throne. He also appointed another son, Shamash-shum-ukin, to rule Babylon. This decision pleased the Babylonians because that son had a Babylonian mother. But many Assyrians were uneasy. A surviving clay tablet written by the court astrologer Adad-shumu-usur warned Esarhaddon that dividing power between two sons might bring conflict instead of peace. Those warnings proved accurate. When Esarhaddon died in 669 BC, both sons took their thrones as planned. But although Shamash-shum-ukin wore the crown of Babylon, real authority remained with Ashurbanipal. An Assyrian garrison stayed in Babylon, loyal only to Nineveh. Even religious duties were carried out by Ashurbanipal, who continued offering sacrifices to Babylonian gods, duties normally reserved for the king of Babylon himself. This made it clear that Shamash-shum-ukin was king in name only. For several years, the brothers maintained a fragile peace. During this time, the Assyrian Empire was still extraordinarily powerful. Its old rival, Urartu, had become a client state, protecting Assyria's northern frontier against nomadic groups like the Cimmerians. In the west, Lydia accepted Assyrian authority. In 653 BC, Ashurbanipal delivered a crushing defeat to Elam. After the victory, he displayed the severed head of the defeated Elamite king Tuman in the gardens of his palace, another reminder of Assyria's overwhelming force. But Shamash-Shum-Ukin wanted more than a symbolic throne. Secretly, he began plotting to break free from Assyria. He contacted the Chaldeans, Elamites, Persians, Arabs, Egyptians, and even the Lydians, trying to build an anti-Assyrian alliance. What he did not know was that Assyria's intelligence network had already discovered the conspiracy. Clay tablets from Ashurbanipal's archives record the suspicious envoys and coded messages linked to his brother. Despite these warnings, nothing was done to stop him. In 652 BC, Shamash-Shum-Ukin launched his rebellion. But the alliance he had built quickly began to fall apart. Egypt offered no help. Lydia, attacked by the Cimmerians at the same time, withdrew from the conflict. The remaining allies acted without unity or strategy. Taking advantage of the division, Assyrian forces attacked each of them separately. One by one, the rebels suffered defeat. By 648 BC, Assyria had captured Babylon. Refusing to be taken alive, Shamash-Shum-Ukin set himself on fire along with his wife and closest followers. Assyrian forces then carried out harsh punishments on the city. Rebels had their tongues torn out and limbs cut off. Their bodies were left unburied so dogs and pigs could devour them. After Babylon was subdued, Assyrian armies marched to punish the Chaldeans, destroy Elam completely, and crush the Arab tribes that had supported the revolt. Ashurbanipal celebrated his victory by arranging a terrifying triumph. He rode in a chariot pulled by 5 captured kings, while other defeated princes walked behind him wearing the severed heads of the rebellion's leaders tied around their necks. At this moment, Assyria seemed unstoppable. Its enemies were broken, its borders stretched farther than ever, and its military reputation was unmatched. But beneath the surface, the empire was beginning to rot from within. Constant wars had exhausted Assyria's strength. The Medes, once defeated, refused to submit again. Egypt broke away almost immediately. Lydia no longer obeyed Assyria, and Ashurbanipal lacked the energy to force their loyalty. The empire's resources were drained, and the outer regions were slipping from control. A new threat appeared on the horizon: the Scythians. Following the movements of the Cimmerians, they pushed into the Near East during the 630s BC, under a leader named Madias. These nomadic warriors swept through the western provinces of the empire like a devastating storm. Already weakened by rebellions and long campaigns, the Assyrians could not repel them. Their sudden arrival shattered what remained of Assyria's stability. Inside the empire, Ashurbanipal lost the support of the military elite. He was pushed aside, left only with the title of King of Babylon. In 627 BC, he died. His death triggered a violent struggle for power among his sons, generals, and remaining nobles. Without strong leadership, the empire began collapsing rapidly. Provinces declared independence one after another. Elam regained its freedom. In Babylon, a Chaldean prince named Nabopolassar seized the throne and immediately began fighting for complete independence. By 619 BC, he had fully liberated Babylonia from Assyrian control. At the same time, Egypt marched north again, occupying territories in Canaan, the Levant, and Syria, regions that had been left vulnerable after the Scythian invasion. Assyria had no strength to challenge them. In desperation, Sin-shar-ishkun, the new Assyrian king, tried to form a coalition to save the empire. He united Assyria with Urartu, the kingdom of Mani, and Egypt. But this alliance came too late. Nabopolassar defeated their combined forces. Meanwhile, the Median king Cyaxares launched an invasion from the east. Both armies rushed toward the ancient city of Ashur. The Medes reached it first. They stormed the city, looted it, and burned it to the ground. On its ruins, Cyaxares and Nabopolassar formed a powerful alliance. In 612 BC, the combined Median and Babylonian armies besieged Nineveh. After 3 months of brutal fighting, the city fell. King Sinsharishkun died during the assault. Assyria's remaining forces retreated west to the city of Haran, where the last Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit II, tried desperately to gather what was left of the empire. But in 610 BC, the Medes captured Haran. 1 year later, Nabopolassar crushed the last Assyrian and Egyptian troops in the region. With that final defeat, the Assyrian Empire, once the first and greatest empire of the ancient world, disappeared completely from history. The fall of Nineveh marked the beginning of the end, but the Assyrian Empire did not vanish instantly. After the city's destruction, the remaining Assyrian generals and soldiers fled westward, gathering in Haran. Here, they attempted to rebuild some form of authority under their last remaining king, Ashur-uballit II. He was determined to restore the empire, even though most of its cities were already gone, and its allies had deserted it. Egypt, still hoping to stop Babylon from becoming too powerful, sent some support to the Assyrians. But even with Egyptian aid, Ashur-uballit's forces were too few, too weak, and too exhausted to stop the powers rising around them. In 610 BC, the Medes marched west and captured Haran, robbing Assyria of its final stronghold. Ashur-uballit II fled again, trying to gather remnants of his forces for one last stand. The next year, 609 BC, he and the Egyptians attempted to retake Haran, but their campaign failed. The Egyptian army suffered heavy losses, and the Assyrian survivors scattered. After this final defeat, Ashur-uballit II disappeared from the historical record. No one knows exactly what happened to him. He may have been killed in battle, executed after capture, or simply died in hiding. But his disappearance symbolized the collapse of Assyria's final hope. By 609 BC, the empire that once ruled from Egypt to Iran and from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf had now been reduced to nothing. Cities like Nineveh, Ashur, and Kalhu that had once stood as symbols of power and terror were now smoldering ruins. The lands that had lived under Assyrian control for centuries were quickly taken over by other rising powers: Babylonians, Medes, Egyptians, and later the Persians. The fall was so total, so complete, that within a few generations, Assyria stopped being a living nation and became only a memory. This rapid collapse astonished later historians. How could a kingdom that had dominated the Near East for over 300 years simply vanish? The reasons were many. Endless warfare drained its resources. Brutal tactics created enemies everywhere. Constant rebellions exhausted the army, and its rigid system of rule made it fragile when central power failed. When Assyria weakened even slightly, countless subject peoples rose up at once, seeking revenge for centuries of suffering. Once that wave of rebellion began, no king, not even one as strong as Ashurbanipal, could have stopped it. And so, after centuries of ruling through fear, the Assyrians found themselves crushed by the very forces they believed they controlled. Their empire had been built on military strength and constant expansion. But when that expansion ended, and the armies began to lose ground, the structures they had created could no longer support themselves. Their road network, their governors, their postal system, everything that once made Assyria powerful, collapsed without strong leadership at the center. Yet even after the fall of their empire, the Assyrians as a people did not disappear. Many survivors moved into small towns and villages across northern Mesopotamia. Some lived under Babylonian and then Persian rule. Others blended into Aramean-speaking communities. Their language and religion slowly faded, but their legacy lived on in the institutions and ideas that shaped later empires. The Persian Empire, for example, adopted many Assyrian innovations: provincial governors, road systems, couriers, imperial administration, and military organization. Even the idea of the King of Kings, later embraced by Persian rulers, echoed old Assyrian royal titles. The shadow of Assyria continued to stretch across the centuries long after the last Assyrian army fell. Their legacy survived not through their cities or monuments, many of which were destroyed, but through the systems of empire they pioneered. This astonishing rise and sudden collapse of Assyria teaches us how fragile even the mightiest powers can be. An empire built on fear may dominate for a time, but the hatred it inspires can grow quietly until the moment of weakness arrives. When that moment came for Assyria, all the peoples it had conquered, Babylonians, Medes, Elamites, Arabs, Arameans, and many more, struck back at once. No empire, no matter how large its armies or high its walls, can survive being hated by every neighbor it has. And so, from being the world's first great military superpower, Assyria became a testament to how quickly power can vanish when built on violence alone. The proud kings who once believed their rule was protected by the god Ashur did not foresee how quickly their empire could be torn apart. Within 1 century, less than a single lifetime, Assyria went from ruling the Near East to being wiped off the map. The story of Assyria's rise and fall still echoes through history, reminding us that every empire, no matter how mighty, is vulnerable to collapse when it forgets the limits of its own power. The story of Assyria often ends with its dramatic fall, but its deeper meaning comes from understanding how a civilization that shaped so much of the ancient world could rise so high and then collapse so completely. Assyria began as a modest collection of trading towns along the Tigris River. Over centuries, it developed advanced systems of organization, engineering, communication, and war. Through determination, ambition, and belief in their divine mission, the Assyrians built the world's first true empire, an empire that set the pattern for many that followed. From the start, Assyria's strength came from discipline, planning, and a clear ideology. The Assyrians saw their god Ashur as the supreme power in the universe, and they believed that spreading his order was their sacred duty. This idea gave their kings confidence and inspired their armies. It justified expansion and shaped the empire's policies. At the same time, this belief made their rule rigid and unforgiving. If their power slipped even slightly, the entire system struggled to function. Assyria's achievements were enormous. They created organized provincial governments, built networks of roads, and used a postal system that allowed messages to travel across the empire at unmatched speed. Their military was one of the best trained and most innovative forces of the ancient world. They could conquer cities with advanced siege machines, battering rams, tunnels, and massive infantry formations. They mastered cavalry tactics and long-distance campaigning. They built palaces decorated with grand stone carvings that still inspire awe today. They collected one of the greatest royal libraries in ancient history. But the same tools that helped them rise also contributed to their downfall. Their system demanded constant expansion. Conquered lands had to supply wealth, labor, and soldiers. When rebellions broke out, they responded with brutal punishments meant to terrorize entire populations. These responses created deep hatred among the conquered peoples. Over time, Assyria surrounded itself with enemies waiting for the moment when the empire weakened. When that weakness finally appeared, the reaction was swift and overwhelming. Rebellions erupted everywhere. Old rivals like Elam, Aramean tribes, and Babylonians rose against them. New threats like the Medes and Scythians attacked with force. Their own provinces stopped cooperating. Governors who once feared Assyrian power began ignoring orders or seeking independence. Without a strong leader, the empire's complex system collapsed quickly. Assyria did not have the flexibility to survive in a world that no longer feared it. Still, in a broader sense, Assyria never truly disappeared. Its ideas and innovations survived through other empires. The Babylonians, who replaced them, inherited their administrative structure. The Persians, who later conquered Babylon, adopted Assyrian models of roads, couriers, governors, and imperial control. Even the brutal tactics that Assyria used in war influenced how later states tried to intimidate or control enemies. Their art inspired architectural styles across the Middle East. Their use of Aramaic spread a language that became dominant for centuries across the region. Assyria's legacy is one of contrasts. It was a land of scholars and scribes, yet also a land feared for its harsh methods. It was home to extraordinary art and architecture, yet also notorious for its violence. It introduced order and structure to vast territories, yet destroyed many cultures along the way. It was a pioneer in government and military design, yet it could not maintain stability once its center weakened. What remains today are its ruins, massive palaces, imposing statues, long carved stone panels, and the countless clay tablets that preserve its history. These discoveries allow us to understand the people who lived in Assyria, their hopes, fears, religions, ambitions, and daily struggles. They allow us to see Assyria not just as a nation of conquerors, but as a complex civilization with achievements that changed the ancient world. Haitiyu, Rise and Fall of Assyria, is a reminder of how fragile power can be when it relies too heavily on fear. It shows how even the strongest empire can fall when surrounded by enemies it helped create. And it demonstrates that influence can outlast the nation that created it. Assyria vanished as a kingdom, but the systems it built continued shaping history long after its cities turned to dust. In the end, the Assyrians, once the most feared people on earth, became a lesson written across the centuries. Power built only on force cannot endure, but ideas, innovations, and cultural achievements can survive long after empires disappear.